Hi, everyone. I am Leah Hinds, and I'd like to welcome all of you to today's webinar, Hyde Park Debate, Resolved, All Scholarship Must Be Made Freely Available for Reading and Reuse. I'm joined by Rick Anderson, Brandon Butler, and Angela Cochran, and thank all of them for joining us today. Before we get started with the debate, though, just a few notes. As almost every webinar out there, this one is in listen-only mode, so we won't be able to hear you if you're speaking to us. We do have an attendee chat for you to use. If you want to take a few moments and try that attendee chat box out, just give us a hello, a hi, where you're from, and your name. That'd be great. So we see who all's out there listening. We also have there's a green question mark icon at the top of your screen to ask questions. Because this is a formal debate, we won't be utilizing the chat box as much. Our presenters are not going to stop during their statements. So we do have, they ask the presenter a question box so that you can save up those questions. They'll be queued for the end, and we'll address questions at that time. Rick will be, as moderator, handling the Q&A session. If you have any problems with your audio, if you're having trouble hearing us, you can try clicking on the phone icon at the top of your screen to switch to using your telephone. And that will give you the audio through your phone, and you can still view the screen. Hello from Florence, Italy. Wow, that's great. Anna Maria, nice to see you here. That caught my eye. The session is being recorded, and it'll be made available on the Charleston Conference website. Within just a couple of days, we'll have it by the end of the day, Friday, most likely, and we'll email everyone that's available. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rick as the moderator. I'll still be here in the background to help with the chat box and answer questions. Hello from Katina. Hi, Katina. So thank you, everyone. Thanks, Rick, Brandon, and Angela, and take it away.
Thanks, Angela, and thanks to Brandon. Thanks, Leah, and thanks to Brandon and Angela for agreeing to this debate. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. So let me quickly introduce our debaters and then also quickly review the structure of the debate for those who haven't participated in one of these before. So arguing in favor of our resolution today is Brandon Butler, who's Director of Information Policy in the Library at the University of Virginia. And arguing against our resolution is Angela Cochran, who is an Associate Publisher at the American Society of Civil Engineers. The way the debate's going to work is that right after I finish with this explanation, we'll take a poll of the audience, and every member of the audience has the opportunity to cast a vote either in support of the revolution, more specifically of the resolution that we're discussing today, or against it. Then each debater will take a turn to offer a 10-minute statement. The first will argue, I think Brandon's first, will argue in favor of the proposition, and then Angela will argue against it. And then after the 10-minute opening statement, each of them will have the opportunity to give a 3-minute response to the other. Following the 3-minute responses, we'll have time to field questions from the attendees, which you can submit using that chat function that Leah mentioned earlier. We probably won't have time to address all of the questions that come through, but we'll go through them in the order that they're received and get through as many as we can. And then following the discussion with the audience, we'll take the same poll again. And this is very important. Anybody who did not vote the first time should refrain from voting the second time, because what we're trying to measure with the second poll is how many votes have moved from one side of the resolution to the other. And the debater who successfully moves the most votes over to his or her side will be declared the winner. And with that, we will now, let me start my timer. We will now turn the time over to Brandon for his opening statement. Just give me 1 second here.
Oh, Rick, just a second. This is Leah again. I just opened the poll, so we'll do just a few minutes for voting here.
Yes, sorry about that.
No, no problem.
Set up my timing or my timer.
Let me know how long you want to leave it. We'll close it out when we're ready.
Yeah, we'll watch and see when the voting slows down.
An interesting split so far. Fairly close.
Yeah, very interesting.
Wow.
That's really interesting.
51-49. This is
Awesome.
amazing. Yeah, ideal.
All right. It looks like the voting stopped. So let's go ahead and shall I close the poll?
I'll go ahead and close it, and just to formally announce, we'll say 55 to 52. 55 yes, 52 no.
All right. And with that, I will start the timer. And Brandon, go.
Hello. I'm here to convince you that all scholarship must be made freely available for access and reuse. That's something I strongly believe to be true. So thanks to Rick Anderson and to the Charleston folks for inviting me to share my reasons with you and hopefully to win a few of you over to my cause. I'm going to proceed by defining two key terms: freely available for access and reuse and scholarship. If you agree with me about the proper meaning of these terms, I think you'll also agree that the resolution should be affirmed. First, I take freely available for access and reuse to be roughly equivalent to free of copyright restrictions. That is, the resolution does not require publishers to donate their services to the public. The infrastructure that supports access must be paid for, and there are a number of ways to do that. Some of them might even involve imposing limits on access to scholarship, and I believe some such limits clearly do not violate the meaning of this resolution. For example, turning off access to a server because no one paid the cost of running it would not violate this resolution. Neither would refusing to publish an article because no one is willing to pay for the scarce time and effort that's required to do so. The resolution does not require that we all drop everything that we're doing and donate our time and resources freely to the infinite proliferation of scholarship. What the resolution requires is only that we refrain from charging the kind of fees that copyright enables rights holders to charge, which are grounded not in the cost or value of scarce services or facilities that make access possible, but rather in the value of the content itself. So, while there are surely dozens of other ways to think about this issue and reasons to support this resolution, for me, and I'm a copyright lawyer, so maybe that's part of why, today's resolution is really about copyright. And my support for today's resolution follows directly from my understanding of the purpose and justification of copyright in the Constitution, the case law, and the Anglo-American legal tradition. If you'll bear with me for a minute while I describe some of these core precepts in the law, I'll then return to scholarship and show why taking these precepts seriously means that scholarship must be free. Two copyright principles undergird my argument. First, copyright relies on incentives as its justification. And second, copyright has a policy of protecting only expression while excluding facts, ideas, systems, and other forms of knowledge from its protection. So first, let's talk about incentives. The Constitution tells us that copyright is a means to an end. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 8 of the Constitution says, Congress shall have the power to promote the progress of science and the useful arts by securing to authors for limited times the exclusive rights in their writings and discoveries. That to blah, 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 by blah, blah, blah structure tells us that progress is the goal. Granting rights for limited times is a mere means to that goal. So in our constitutional framework, copyright needs a utilitarian justification. When limiting access and reuse no longer promotes progress, it loses its constitutional basis. The heart of this justification is an assumption, the assumption that a limited term of protection provides authors with a necessary incentive to use their scarce time producing original works of expression. Without copyright, an author might not take the risk of writing a book, only to have others copy and sell the book without sharing the proceeds. Would-be creators could divert their time instead to more remunerative pursuits. Recent Supreme Court cases tell us that incentives for distribution are also a goal of copyright, and so publishers are presumed to require some exclusive control in some cases in order to earn a profit from their catalog. So, copyright is all about those incentives. If you don't need incentives, you don't need copyright. Now, let's talk about copyright and knowledge. Here's where I get to bring in a little local celebrity from right here in Charlottesville, where I live. The founder of UVA, Thomas Jefferson, famously wrote, "He who receives an idea from me receives instruction himself without lessening mine, as he who lights his taper at mine receives light without darkening me." And this is the 18th century version of information wants to be free, or as an economist would say, Information is non-rivalrous. It can be shared infinitely without running out. And copyright in the US has been carefully crafted and applied in the courts so as to avoid interfering with the free flow of knowledge as distinct from expression. And it gives authors limited rights in the use of their expression, but not in the underlying knowledge. So copyright in a given work applies only to its original expressive content, not to facts, ideas, discoveries, and other forms of knowledge that are expressed within it. Anyone is free to talk about, write about, and build upon the theories, discoveries, and knowledge that they find in journal articles, but they cannot yet share the embodiment of those discoveries in the article. This is how Malcolm Gladwell, for example, can make a career out of hunting for interesting factoids and findings in the scholarly literature and then just sort of re-expressing them in a way that is more pleasing to lay readers. So finding and distributing facts and ideas can be expensive, hard work. And some have argued that the law should reward this sweat of the brow by granting exclusive control to the people who do it over not just their expression, but the underlying facts too. The Supreme Court clearly rejected these arguments. In the case Feist versus Rural Telephone Company about dueling telephone book publishers, Justice O'Connor wrote passionately that facts must remain free. She said, "It may seem unfair that much of the fruit of the fact compiler's labor may be used by others without compensation. However, this is not some unforeseen byproduct of a statutory scheme. It is rather the essence of copyright and a constitutional requirement. The primary objective of copyright is not to reward the labor of authors or publishers, but to promote the progress of science and useful arts. To this end, copyright assures authors the right to their original expression, but encourages others to build freely upon the ideas and information conveyed by a work." In later cases, the court identified the idea-expression dichotomy, the same thing I've been talking about, as a First Amendment safety valve in copyright, and without it, the law would be in conflict with the rights of free expression. One last copyright doctrine bears mentioning, and that is merger. Under the merger doctrine, if a fact or an idea is susceptible to only a few modes of expression, those expressions are said to merge with the underlying fact and to become exempt from copyright protection. Merger prevents a copyright holder from obtaining a monopoly on a fact or an idea by securing a copyright in an essential mode of expressing it. So, I've laid the groundwork. Copyright does not protect facts, ideas, and discoveries and other forms of pure knowledge. Even when these things are hard to find, when they're expensive to discover, copyright withholds protection and forces discoverers of facts to find new ways to recover their costs. Jefferson's taper must be free to spread its light. So now we can turn back to scholarship, by which I mean the written record of new discoveries, ideas, theories, arguments, and counterarguments created by scholars and published with the primary goal of conveying this new knowledge. Scholarship has two key characteristics that make it a poor fit for copyright protection. First, scholars do not need and do not receive copyright's incentives for creation. Scholars write to expand the frontiers of knowledge, to accrue prestige in their fields, and as part of their professional duties and identities. They do not write in hopes of participating in the profits generated by selling access to their work. Indeed, they are almost never compensated monetarily by publishers or readers. University salaries, grant funding, and other systems provide scholars all the monetary security they need to pursue their research. What about publisher incentives? Here I have two responses. One is that there are plenty of ways to get publishers paid for their work that don't involve charging for access and reuse of scholarship. You all probably know the various models as well or better than I do. And of course, there are reasonable arguments that publishing as we know it isn't really a great fit for scholarship, and that something more like federated open repositories run by universities would be better. In any event, there is no reason to believe that in a world without copyright, scholarship would cease to exist. Indeed, there is good reason to treat publishers of scholarship the way the Supreme Court treated publishers of phone books, i.e., to hold that the principle of free flow of knowledge trumps any concern about their incentives. We should take that approach because the primary value of scholarship is in its novel contributions to knowledge, not in its expressive virtues, the clarity or entertainment value of its prose, for example. So the logic of merger also applies neatly to scholarship. When someone is looking to fully access the facts in scholarship, they insist on reading the version of record. A digest or a summary that purports to produce the key results of research, but not in the original words of the published version, simply won't do. This extremely close connection between scholarship as particular written expression and the uncopyrightable knowledge that it describes should trigger the logic of the merger doctrine. Unless we free the authoritative scholarly expression of knowledge, we are unduly constraining the spread of knowledge itself. So, since copyright's incentives are not needed and its application fetters the free flow of facts and ideas, I hope you'll agree with me that scholarship must be made freely available for access and reuse. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Brandon. We will now turn it over to Angela. Angela, I am starting the timer now.
Thanks, Rick. If you had told me I was going to be debating a lawyer, I may not have agreed to this, but that's okay. I don't believe that it has been resolved that scholarship must be made freely available for access and reuse, and I have 6 key points to this assertion. 1, in order for the statement to be considered resolved, the vast majority of participants in scholarship would need to agree, and that is just not the case. I have the privilege of working with civil engineers, and they, by and large, do not subscribe to the resolution statement. This is not unique to civil engineers. My colleagues in mechanical, electrical, aerospace, and other engineering disciplines have not seen their communities embrace open science. Likewise, researchers in chemistry and math have been slow to see the needs and/or benefits of open access publishing. One reason why this is the case in many physical sciences is that the funding is not restricted to government agencies or philanthropic funds. Industry, for-profit corporations, or trade associations that represent them fund a significant amount of research and have yet to impose any mandates on access to scholarship resulting from those grants. Some of those industry groups require that any data compiled and analyzed remain proprietary as a condition of funding. Physical science is also seeing greater participation from countries like China, India, and parts of the Middle East where funder mandates for free access is not yet a priority, though that can certainly change. The situation for humanities and social sciences is even more bleak, with only a fraction of the federal funding available and very little philanthropic investment compared to what we have seen in biomedical communities. Additionally, the practice of publishing monographs as opposed to journal articles is a larger barrier in open access, as the costs are typically around $10,000 as opposed to a journal article fees from $1,500 to $3,000. My second point is that it's not clear to me which scholarship must be free. Again, an argument could be made that certain deliverables from taxpayer-funded research be made publicly available, but what exactly do those funders have ownership of? Typical grant deliverables required include a report to an agency and increasingly data or materials collected. It seems reasonable to expect those outputs to be made freely available. For the most part, subsequent publications in a journal or a book are not requirements of funding. If grantees are not required to publish scholarship resulting from their funded research in journals or books, then why do they do so? Well, authors are asked this question frequently in surveys, and the answers are always the same: career advancement, legitimacy bestowed by the publication peer review process, future funding, and dissemination to an audience or community interested in the same research area. The broken incentive structure for academics means that many researchers attempt to produce as many papers as possible from one grant. This is encouraged not only by their institutions, but also the funding agencies that want to see the maximum output from their funding dollars. This leads me to my third point. We have not resolved the question of who should pay for the dissemination of scholarship in publication formats. Currently, the most common source of payment are institutional libraries via subscription and open access payment models. Funding agencies through their own publication outlets, their own repositories, or allowance of open access fees from grant money. Individual authors who largely find the money from either their funder or the institution where they work, and increasingly philanthropic endeavors. There are obviously problems with these scenarios, which is why a shared expense solution has yet to be found. The current APC model is leaving out researchers that aren't well funded, whether they are from the Global South, Africa, or small institutions in the US. Further, funding agencies are beholden to the whims of elected officials, and institutional libraries are largely being sidelined by larger institutional investments. I would be remiss to ignore the growing concerns that all of these stakeholders are less comfortable with supporting access to research by paying large commercial for-profit publishers. As I have described the challenges with who is paying, I must also express the obvious. There are costs. At this time, there is not widespread support amongst the participants in scholarship that peer review and production services are unnecessary. Peer review is still valued by the vast majority of the overall research community as a valuable service provided by fellow researchers and facilitated by publications. Likewise, language cleanup, reference linking, tagging, online posting in multiple formats, metadata creation and delivery, search engine optimization, and archiving for discovery in perpetuity are not only desirable services, but vital for authors and communities they represent. Of course, all of these services carry expenses. Many have lamented the high cost of publishing. A 2008 report conducted by Cambridge Economic Policy Associates concluded that article costs for low rejection rate journals average about $1,500, with high rejection rate journals over $4,000 per article. These estimates seem in line with some open access publishers, including PLOS, whose financial disclosures indicate a cost of about $1,500 per article, and eLife hovering at a little over $4,000, per the recently released STM report. The expenses related to expected journal and book activities are not insignificant. I suspect we won't see any drastic reductions until those services are deemed unnecessary by the global community. Globalization is another topic I would like to briefly discuss. The aforementioned 2018 STM report found that China has overtaken the U.S. in article output, claiming 19% of articles, while the U.S. claims 18%. Further, the report claims that looking at current trends, China will outpace the U.S. in funding research in the early 2020s. China has a national strategy for becoming the world leader in quality research, and they're putting their money where it's needed. My point in mentioning this is that the fate of access to scholarship may largely rest with China as a major influencer and not the White House Office of Science Technology Policy or the European coalition behind Plan S. It remains to be seen how China might decide to weigh in on access issues, but I don't believe we consider anything resolved until that happens. My next point is that the reuse of scholarship may be less resolved than free access to scholarship. The Creative Commons licenses have been largely hailed as the license of choice for designating reuse. However, while CC BY, a liberal license that only asks for attribution, is the de facto OA choice, many authors are not comfortable with this license and have strong preferences for Creative Commons licenses that allow for restrictions on derivative works or commercial exploitations of the work. Many authors who see value in having their work made freely accessible are forced to accept attribution-only models, but when given choices, more restrictive licenses are preferred. BioRxiv has reported that the Creative Commons non-commercial license is the most widely selected choice made by researchers on their platform. Likewise, the 2014 Open Access Author Survey by Taylor and Francis found that the most preferred license is the Creative Commons BY NC ND, which puts limits on derivatives and commercial reuse. In fact, the survey found that overwhelmingly the least preferred license was the CC BY license. Liberal reuse licenses suffer from fears that fraudulent behavior will tarnish the reputation of the researchers, or even worse, lead to dangerous outcomes. More and more authors are finding that papers they publish have been republished in disreputable journals with completely new author names replacing the original team. A discussion I recently had with a lawyer and some researchers explored whether a paper published under CC BY could be republished under a new author's name with a tiny 6-point type attribution somewhere in the footnote. The resolution that it was likely allowed under the CC BY license, but it would be considered unethical, and an aggrieved author would likely need to sue in order to find out for sure. The threat of litigation has been raised in trying to determine the limits of non-commercial provisions of the Creative Commons licenses as well. Personally, I'm concerned about subjecting authors to licenses that are so ambiguous as to the author rights that only a court of law would determine what is actually allowed or not allowed. In closing, while the scholarly ecosystem has certainly moved a lot closer to the resolution statement in the last 10 years or so, I think it's too early to consider it resolved. I would like to see new business models emerge that allow for quality publication of scholarly content under some sort of shared expense arrangement. New business models must be sustainable for all parties involved. Wide adoption of preprint activity, as well as green OA or self-archiving practices, will push the scholarly community even closer to the resolution statement. That said, preprint servers are largely supported by philanthropic enterprises and do not necessarily represent a sustainable business model, and Green OA still suffers from low author compliance, even with funder and university mandates. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Angela. We will now proceed to the 3-minute responses, but before we do so, I just want to remind all of our attendees that you can go ahead and start submitting questions or comments whenever you'd like, and we'll just save them up and then address them in the order received immediately following the second 3-minute response. So for the first 3-minute response, I will now turn the time back over to Brandon.
Thank you. So Angela makes a variety of interesting arguments in her opening statement, but they all miss the mark. This resolution is a mandate, not a prediction. We resolve that all scholarship must be free, not that all scholarship will soon be free. Endorsing the resolution is mandating that result, not predicting it. And that's important because all of the challenges Angela raises threaten to keep us stuck in this dysfunctional, wasteful model for years to come. We actually need a mandate to cut through the inertia and unleash the creativity that's needed to develop new models and tools to support free scholarship. Once we mandate that scholarship be set free, her objections evaporate. Angela suggests that setting scholarship free would be frustrated by diversity of opinion across disciplines, countries, and funders, and the humanities in particular might suffer. In fact, once we set scholarship free, diversity would let the disciplines learn from each other, just as many preprint servers has started up following the model that physical scientists have established with arXiv. Diversity will be a source of strength. Humanists in particular would benefit from this change. While some models of free access may be an awkward fit for them, the current model is already toxic. The explosive growth in cost for STEM content has driven library purchasing of monographs and other humanities content steadily down for decades. Humanists will certainly be better off in a world where libraries are not paying millions for access to prestige STEM journals. Angela asks, which scholarship should be freely available? Simple, all of it. All of it. All of it is written by authors with no expectation of royalties from licenses. If we set it all free, the vendors and service providers who support it will have to compete on quality and price, not entrenched copyright monopolies. Creativity and competition will be unleashed right alongside knowledge. Finally, Angela mentions that academic authors often misunderstand and mistrust open licenses, or that they prefer restrictive ones. Here we do have some education to do, for sure. For example, passing off someone else's work as your own is clearly barred by the CC BY license, among other things. Mandating that all scholarship be free would actually help allay these fears because no one could profit commercially merely from selling access to scholarship that's already free. And anyone could easily use the scholarly literature that's openly available to detect plagiarists and to identify the true originators of ideas. The status quo is much worse for authors, whether they realize it or not. Big commercial actors already profit massively by free writing on academic work at the expense of our academic institutions. They deny access to millions who can't afford it. They bar authors themselves from sharing their work on their own websites, repositories, and academic social networks. Scholars may be wary of a world where their work is free, but they are much worse off in this world where it is locked away. Thank you.
Perfect timing. All right, Angela, you now have 3 minutes to respond.
Okay, thank you very much. I am not a copyright attorney, nor have I ever played one on TV. With that said, the argument seemed to be that copyright must not be applied to scholarship, and publishers should not be expected to improve and distribute content for free. This is what we currently call the gold OA model, a model that claims no one should pay to access content, but publishers should still peer review and curate content. With all due respect to Thomas Jefferson, information doesn't just want to be free. Information wants to be normalized, populated in multiple outlets and in an ever-growing list of formats. It wants to be put in front of the persons who need it most at the moment they need it. Making information free does not make it good, useful, or discoverable. There's plenty of free information on the internet. A lot of it is wrong, and a lot of it can't be found by those who need it. In fact, as I talk to our authors and editorial boards about data sharing, their biggest concerns are about how people will find it once they put it in a repository. The answer is easy. It needs a DOI. It needs rich metadata that is tagged for optimal search engine optimization. It needs to be linked to other outputs like conference papers and journal articles. It needs for these links to be disseminated via citation linking facilitated by Crossref. In order to be useful to people, there needs to be an explanation of what the data is, where it came from, who collected it, where it was collected from, and how it was analyzed. This is not an argument for not making information free, but free is actually the least of the concerns for the information. My opponent spoke in support of the value added to journal articles by publishers, and he supports a model whereby publishers are compensated. Where I have concern is that he argues that publishers should only be paid for what it costs to produce an article. The infrastructure that supports all the things that researchers value in publisher services has been built and maintained by publishers. Publishers pay to develop standard DTDs so that XML content is portable and able to be text mined. Publishers developed and continue to financially support a strong reference linking ecosystem through Crossref. Publishers have developed online platforms specifically designed for the content formats produced in scholarship. None of those initiatives would have been funded without significant investment from publishers. Further, reducing the services provided by publishers to a mere vendor arrangement negates the responsibilities to scholarship as a whole. Scholarly publishers, particularly society publishers, expend a great deal of resources to ensuring that quality work is distributed through a brand to a specific community. Treating publishers as vendors reduces that role and leads to lowered community standards and loss of curation. In closing, if all scholarship must be free to access and reuse, and in my opponent's statement, free of copyright, a sustainable business model must be explored. I don't believe an APC model is equitable or sustainable. I do believe that libraries and publishers need to come together to innovate a shared expense model that levels that playing field. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Angela. All right, we are now ready to move to the Q&A portion. And we have had one question come in through attendee chat. This is from Tim Lloyd. And the question is, if the legal question is as clear as presented by Brandon, why hasn't this already been resolved in the courts? Sounds like that's mainly a question for Brandon, so we'll start with him.
Yeah, so it hasn't been resolved in the courts because the arguments I'm making are based on the kind of deep constitutional values and policy propositions that underlie copyright. So copyright law itself is very mechanistic. It sort of awards copyright to anybody who meets a minimum threshold. And what I'm arguing is that if you understand where copyright comes from, its core purposes, and so on, I think you'll see that copyright should be reformed in the way that I described so that scholars are not awarded copyrights because the work they do doesn't need it as an incentive. And because it encodes a knowledge base that should be free. This is not an original argument to me, by the way. Justice Breyer wrote an article in the 1970s that says essentially the same thing.
Angela, anything to add?
No, I don't have anything to add to that. Thank you.
Okay. Here's another comment, which it's not really a question, a statement, but I'll give you guys a chance to respond to it. The comment is, but publishers don't do the peer review, scholars do it for free. Angela, we'll let you respond first if you'd like.
Sure. While that is true that the peer review reports and the decisions that are being made are being done by researchers and academics within the scholarly community, there is a facilitation process that really gets trivialized a lot. And that always concerns me particularly because I run an editorial department of 35 journals. So I understand the amount of work and care that my team puts in to make sure that this happens in a timely fashion. I really don't think that there has to be some sort of facilitating process. So we pay a lot for manuscript submission systems so that we're no longer having people mailing and emailing author manuscripts back and forth. We take great care in assuring that there's confidentiality between reviewers and authors. We review the review comments to make sure that there's nothing that would be considered insulting for an author or inappropriate. And we are very much on top of ensuring that answers and reviews get returned to authors in a timely fashion. And I just don't think that without that kind of facilitated structure in place, that peer review would happen in a timely fashion. We also spend a great deal of time making sure that authors are following standards that their community has agreed to, whether it's equator standards or consort standards, making sure that trials are being registered. We run things through plagiarism detection to make sure and review all of those reports to make sure that there aren't considerations between what's actually being plagiarized versus, what's an author building on their own work. So there's a lot of work that goes in on the publisher side to help facilitate peer review.
So I want to chime in just to say my position is actually sort of at worst agnostic, maybe at best optimistic about the value that publishers bring to the table. I know that some folks, I have no love for some of the most, predatory publishers like, the big people that really hurt our budgets. But I understand, and more as I've entered these debates, the value that many publishers bring to the table. My only point is, if those services and that professional value that you bring to the table is valuable, people will pay for it. That is, you can charge for that. We will develop models. If we can't do without these things, then we will find ways to work together to get the people who do them well paid. But you should compete based on who is good at those things that we agree are the important things that make scholarship better. And then you'll get paid to do those things. I find that exploiting the copyright monopoly as a way to get paid ends up untethering the compensation from the quality of the work. So Elsevier makes a lot more money than people who do a better job than they do, because Elsevier has a monopoly over prestigious journal titles. I would like to see people who are good at publishing get paid for being good at publishing, rather than seeing people take unfair profits based on just their ownership of legacy journal titles.
All right, the next question. This one's directed to Angela. Angela, if scholarship is free and open, publishers can still sell the quote-unquote packaged knowledge, while the knowledge itself is freely accessible elsewhere. However, publishers lock the knowledge away by taking copyright from authors and locking it behind a paywall. Your response?
Yes, that is the current model, and I am open to exploring different ways of achieving that model. I think that I feel like there's a bit of a game of chicken going on, honestly, between publishers and libraries. And I have a sense that libraries have, like these deep, dark, secret meetings where they come up with these really awesome plans for how they would like to, what they'd be comfortable with a payment plan. And I think publishers talk about these things too, but then they get nervous talking to each other about them. That might be overly optimistic, but I just don't think we've got this figured out yet, because there's really not a widespread acceptance of open access. And I know that we hear an awful lot about open access, and we hear an awful lot about public access mandates from funders, and which are two totally different topics. But I'm still struggling with our community that doesn't support open access models. And I get concerned about, sort of this argument of let's go ahead and just flip everything when there's not widespread support for it. The other thing that, I don't really have a strong argument around the copyright issues. I've been trying to figure out if a subscription model could continue to work without copyright, with adopting, let's say, Creative Commons licenses or some other publication license that's not as restrictive as copyright. I've been exploring what are the things that we need copyright for as far as us redistributing an author's work to other outlets and other channels, and a lot of that can be accommodated through licensing models. So I'm not going to make a strong argument that publishers need to continue to retain some sort of copyright. I do think that we haven't quite worked out what the incentive would be for publishers to add value and invest in an author's paper if they aren't going to be compensated for it in an acceptable way.
Brandon, anything to add?
No, that's okay. There's lots of questions. Let's see if we can move to some other ones.
Let's see. I'll skip over a couple of people who have already had one question answered. Here's the next one. Should scholarly communication be curated? Isn't that the crux of the argument? Brandon, you want to go first with this one?
Sure. Well, I think it's an interesting question. What the resolution does is it forces us to ask about the value of all of these activities that have so far been subsidized by charging for monopoly access to prestigious journal titles. And so, I think if we take away that mode of support for publication activities, it'll impose a little market discipline on the folks who are doing things outside of the academy and force them to make a value proposition that is more compelling. So curation is something that perhaps faculty members could do as part of their service to their discipline. In fact, they already do that, right? They serve on editorial boards, they do peer review. And so I know many sort of advocates for open access say that kind of content focused, as distinct from maybe, sort of service metadata, the stuff that doesn't require a specialist in the field, but may require a specialist in publishing. The things that require specialists in the field, again, was the kind of thing that specialists do for free as part of their service mission. And so it may be that curation is the kind of thing that would be ripe to be sort of done for free by scholars without any need to compensate anybody above their ordinary, faculty salary.
All right. Let's see. The next question. Vast increases in the volume of published research seems to be feeding the pricing problem. It would occur in either scenario. Can the speakers address the issue of volume increases in outputs?
Yeah, I think for organizations, for smaller publishers and society publishers, this increased volume has been a real challenge. And we're receiving more papers than we've ever received. We've had like a 60% increase in the number of papers submitted to us in the last 5 years. And it's a huge staff burden. It's a huge burden on our editors, and it's a huge expense. Every paper submitted has an expense to it. And in our community, submission fees are not part of sort of the normal practice. And so we have not instituted submission fees. So not only are we receiving more papers that are being reviewed, we're also publishing a lot more papers than we ever have before. We have volunteer editors, and we're a mission-driven society. And so we're not with a commercial publisher, so we're independently publishing. So we don't hold our editors to certain page counts. We are asking them to select the best content that they receive and push that forward for publication in the journals. And so the amount of content we're publishing has been increasing at a pace higher than what we have been comfortable with increasing our subscription costs, our subscription fees. So while we may be publishing 15 to 20% more than we were 5 years ago, we're certainly not charging 15 to 20% more than we were 5 years ago. And so there needs to be, there is a lot of pressure on the system, and I think it's going to continue. A lot of societies have alleviated some of that pressure, and big publishers alleviated some of that pressure with open access journals that have a cascading peer review model. That is not something that's available in my community, given that there's little comfort with the open access journals in general.
Brandon, comments on the volume issue?
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like the reason that high volume is a costly problem under the current model is that the part of the value that a journal adds is curation, to connect to our earlier commenter. And curation means you have to look at all those submissions and figure out which ones are going to go in the journal. So it may be that, again, this notion that, you know, the way you establish the value of your service is by constraining how much you put out, and then charging for access to that curated collection, and no one gets access to the choices you've made unless they pay you. Again, setting the scholarship free would change that dynamic. That is, it would change the value proposition such that, you know, the imperative to spend time on curation would be different in that context, and it would again raise the question that I raised earlier, which is, what is the value of curation? How is it best done? Who should do it, and how should they get paid? And I think copyright and artificial scarcity and access only distorts all of these questions and makes them harder to wrestle with. If journals didn't have to rely on this artificial scarcity as part of their value proposition, then maybe they could think more broadly about how to handle a growing and ever-growing volume of scholarship that needs to meet the public eye.
Okay, thanks. Next comment. This is more of a statement than a question, but I'll give you guys a chance to
That's respond. How you know it's an academic debate.
In my experience, publishers won't work on the price problem. They simply won't. They take a larger and larger share of the library's budget every year, cutting into services, personnel costs, and programs. There is now no incentive for publishers to be fair with prices. All we can do is walk away, and they still don't budge. It's not a level playing field. Angela, since this is directed at publishers, I'll let you answer first.
Okay. That may very well be the case, but I would fall to, really trying to stay away from the trap that all publishers are the same. I feel like I spend an enormous amount of time trying to defend publishers when really the criticism is more toward some of the commercial publishers that are beholden to shareholders. And I think that there is an opportunity for libraries and to review where they're getting the most value for their content, and to maybe not consider the smaller publishers and the society publishers as those that get whatever's left over after they pay the commercial publishers. There is a lot of valuable content that is being produced outside of the commercial publishers. And honestly, the more that small and society publishers get sort of pushed out of things like sitting at a table for national deals, or other kinds of discussions around funding mandates and such, the more society publishers like ours that are independent are going to find themselves having to partner with an Elsevier or a Wiley or a Taylor and Francis. And at that point, the libraries will only have those publishers to deal with.
It's already happening. It's already, I mean, that is the dynamic that has happened for a decade and change. They've been building their oligopoly. I don't disagree with anything Angela just said. And I think that approving this resolution would only make her life better. because I think, and I seriously, I honestly believe that. And I think, I'm in the dark meetings on the library side, you're in the dark meetings on the publisher side, and we should talk. Because the big pigs, as one of my colleagues calls them, they are destroying our budgets, and they are doing it for their shareholders. Their profit margins prove that they are operating, at an immensely extractive business model. And approving this resolution would cut the legs out from under them in a way that I think would only redound to the benefit of the less greedy, smaller publishers who I think would still have a strong value proposition left in the communities that they serve because of the value that they add, that they genuinely add, that has nothing to do with being big, powerful entities that have bought a stable of entrenched copyright monopolies. That is the source of the big guys' power. And I think if we took that power away, we would see very quickly a shift in focus back to the scholarly societies and the smaller publishers who, again, I think would still have a stronger value proposition. And that as libraries like mine strongly consider scaling back what we invest in these big folks, the beneficiaries will be the smaller publishers. We're not going to walk away entirely from commercial publishers or from non-open access outlets. What we're trying to do is free up our budget so that we can support a more vibrant ecosystem instead of this kind of big deal monoculture that we find ourselves in now. But I think supporting this resolution is a step in the right direction that serves both of our interests.
All right, I think with that, we've got about, by 1 o'clock, it looks like we've got about 8 minutes left. So let's entertain one more comment. Here's a question that I think both of you can respond to. Many authors have to, quote, transfer their copyright, unquote, to a designated publisher. How is this beneficial to the author and to scholarship? Brandon, we'll let you go first this time.
Yeah, it's not. They are told that it is, and that is a lie. And it makes me very sad. Some publishers say, and I think some publishers believe this, but it's just not true, that, we have to have your copyright in order to protect you against other people who might, plagiarize from you and so on. That's not true. It would be trivially simple for a publisher if they were to discover that someone is doing something untoward with your article to then go back to the author and say, hey, let's work together and get a permission, whatever permission they might need to get into court if they didn't have a sufficiently robust license to get into court. It is not necessary to transfer your copyright to a publisher in order for them to look out for your best interests. So I think that's an indefensible argument.
Angela?
So you're going to ask me to defend the indefensible I think that we have, that there's a lot that happens with the content, that the publisher does with the content besides just putting it between the journal covers. And I do not know enough about copyright law and restrictions to say what we can and cannot do if we don't have a copyright transfer. I've already said I don't have particularly strong moral arguments or feelings about authors transferring copyright to publishers. I think that there could be other licenses that allow for publishers to do the things that we do, and the things that we do that I'm talking about are value add activities. We want to make sure, of course, that we can repackage articles in ways that serve an audience and serve members, and whether or not copyright is involved in that process, I don't necessarily have a strong argument for continuing that. I just think that we need to come up with an alternative. Okay, thanks very much to both Brandon and Angela, and thanks to all of you
who have sent in comments and questions. I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all of them. We are now ready to redo the poll. And I want to make a very, very important note here, and that is we want everybody who voted at the outset to vote again. We want nobody who did not vote at the outset to vote now, because what we want to see is how many votes moved in which direction. So I can see the voting has begun, and we'll watch and see what happens. And by the way, by way of reminder, I believe, and Leah, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that the final vote tally in our first poll was 55 in favor and 52 against the resolution.
That's correct. 55 votes that said yes, I agree, which was 51%, 52 for no, I disagree, 49%.
This feels like watching that needle on election night on the New York Times. The stakes are a little lower, but I'm still, a little nervous.
Actually, it's starting to look more like the World Series.
Let's hope it doesn't last as long as
the Red Sox.
And, oh, still coming in a little bit. All right, it looks like the voting has slowed to a stop.
We've confused everyone, Brandon.
I know. We got too friendly at the end, I think. There are people who think that if they don't vote at all, maybe we'll just work it out, I think.
We could do that.
What's interesting is that both sides ended up with a net loss in votes, but clearly the most votes remaining are clearly in favor of the resolution. All right, so it looks like at this point we can declare Brandon the winner of the debate.
Congratulations.
Yay.
Never debating a lawyer again.
It's a dangerous business.
It was a lot of fun.
All right, I'm going to close the poll here. The final numbers, 54, yes, I agree, 41, no, I disagree. So the poll is now closed. Thanks to everyone, to Rick for moderating, to Brandon and Angela for being debaters, for being good sports. It's a very fascinating debate. I learned a lot. Thanks to all of our listeners and our participants for tuning in. And I will catch you next time, same place, for our next webinar next month. Thanks a lot. Have a good day. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Bye,
you.
Alan.